Eleanor Whitmore placed the $2 million check on the table without looking the man across from her in the eye. She had done exactly this 11 times before, and 11 men had failed. Her father's 1971 Lamborghini Miura still sat in the glass garage like a $4 million coffin, untouched, silent, draped in black velvet. But the man standing before her today wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a blue work uniform with oil still on his hands, and he didn't glance at the check. He didn't ask about the money, he only asked, "Fuse number 7, has anyone replaced it?" One man with oil still on his hands, one $9 question, and everything she had built was about to shake. Eleanor Whitmore stood alone in the glass garage at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, the way she had stood every time she visited her father's estate over the past 3 years. The space was 400 square meters of polished concrete and floor-to-ceiling glass panels, custom built for a man who had loved machines the way other men loved music. A single car occupied the center of the room. The 1971 Lamborghini Miura P400 Sfi in Giallo Miura, a shade of yellow so deep and warm it looked like hardened sunlight, sat beneath its black velvet cover untouched. The halogen fixtures above cast the room in the kind of light that made everything look sacred. Eleanor stood at the edge of the cover and did not lift it. She just looked at the shape beneath the cloth and breathed. The garage smelled like old leather and motor oil, and the particular kind of stillness that only exists in rooms where something beloved has been put away and not yet retrieved. Joseph Whitmore had been a loud man in the best possible way. At 68, he was the kind of person who filled a room not with noise but with energy, laughing too hard at his own stories, pouring wine for strangers, remembering the names of every person he had ever met. He had raced cars recreationally in his 40s, never professionally but with a competitive joy that embarrassed his pit crew and delighted every spectator. The Miura had been his second great love, behind only his wife Margaret. He had purchased it in 1988 at a private auction in Geneva, flown it home, and spent 3 months restoring it himself in the driveway of their first house in Oak Park. In the summer of 1991, he and Margaret had driven it through 12 states in 22 days. No itinerary, no hotel reservations, just 2 people and a screaming Italian V12 and an open road. Eleanor had grown up looking at the photographs on the hallway wall, her mother's hair whipping across her face in the open air, her father's hand on the wheel, both of them grinning like teenagers. She had memorized those photographs before she could read. On the night Margaret Whitmore died, the Lamborghini had been idling in the garage. Joseph had been warming it up for an early morning drive the following day, a habit he kept through every season. At 11:47 that night, while Eleanor was still driving to the hospital and Joseph was sitting in a waiting room holding a paper cup of cold coffee, the engine cut off. No warning, no sputtering. One moment it was running, the next it was not. By the time Joseph returned home 3 days later, the car had not been touched. He walked into the garage, stood in front of it, and said nothing for a very long time. Then he told Eleanor, who had come with him, that the car had stopped because Margaret had called it home. He said it the way a man says something he needs to believe more than he needs to be believed. Eleanor did not argue. She covered the car with the velvet cloth and drove her father to bed, and Joseph Whitmore, a man who had been loud and alive and constantly in motion, began to grow quieter. He stopped eating regularly. He stopped taking calls. He moved through his days the way a man moves through a room he is already leaving. Within 18 months he was at Mercy General, his lungs failing in the slow, patient way that grief accelerates everything it touches. The call that changed Eleanor's course came from Dr. Isaac Brennan on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks before she hired Lucas Grant. Dr. Brennan was a careful man who chose his words the way a watchmaker chose components, precisely and without waste. He told Eleanor that her father's physical decline had reached a plateau that medicine could sustain but not reverse, and that the decisive variable now was motivation. "Joseph has stopped wanting to get better," Dr. Brennan said. "I have watched this happen in patients before. When a person decides that the life ahead of them holds less than the life behind them, the body begins to follow that decision. What your father needs is a reason to stay curious about tomorrow." Eleanor had asked what that looked like in practical terms. Dr. Brennan paused. "I don't know for certain, but he has spoken about that car 4 times in our last 2 appointments. Once about how it sounds at full throttle. Once about the way the gearbox feels on a mountain road. The other 2 times he simply said that he missed it." Eleanor had not spoken for a moment. Then she said quietly, "I'll fix it." She drove directly to the estate after the call, walked into the garage at 11 o'clock that night, pulled the velvet cover down, looked at the Miura's unblinking headlights in the halogen glow, and called her assistant Diana Walsh. "Find me the best Lamborghini restorer in the country," she said. "Money is not a factor." Money turned out to be exactly the wrong factor to emphasize. Within 48 hours, Diana had arranged the first of what would become a long and humiliating procession. 3 specialists arrived from Los Angeles in the first 2 weeks, men with business cards printed on heavy stock and confidence that entered the room before they did. They diagnosed a blocked fuel delivery system and proposed a complete overhaul for $180,000. Eleanor approved it without negotiation. The work was done with the kind of theatrical precision that implied success was guaranteed. The invoices were itemized and professional. The explanation of what had been accomplished filled 4 pages. The car did not start. The specialists offered a follow-up assessment. Eleanor showed them the door. A specialist arrived from Miami in week 3. An Italian-born engineer named Adriano, who had worked at Lamborghini's facility in Sant'Agata Bolognese during the 1980s and who carried the particular authority of a man who had touched the original. He inspected the car for 35 minutes, spoke in clipped declarative sentences, and announced that the V12 engine block had developed irreparable internal tolerances and required a complete rebuild. $320,000. 6 weeks. He was certain Eleanor approved the work. 6 weeks later, the car still would not start. The engineer returned her call on the 7th attempt. The work had been done correctly, he insisted. The problem must lie elsewhere. Eleanor thanked him and did not call back. By the 8th week, the specialists were arriving in overlapping waves. 2 firms from New York with backgrounds in classic car auction preparation, a team from a Concours restoration house in Scottsdale, independent consultants from Chicago and Atlanta whose credentials were impeccable and whose results were uniform. Each man had a theory. Each theory cost money. The carburetor was replaced. The ignition coils were replaced. The distributor cap and timing chain were replaced. A fuel pump that cost $22,000 was installed and subsequently removed when it made no difference. One consultant spent 4 days on the electrical system and left behind 40 pages of documentation and a car that was exactly as silent as it had been when he arrived. By the time 11 specialists had come and gone, Eleanor had spent $1,700,000 and the Miura had not made a single sound. The final specialist before Lucas Grant was a man named Adrian Mercer. 52 years old, based in Beverly Hills, the author of 2 well-regarded books on Italian sports car restoration, a recurring feature subject in automotive publications, and the acknowledged authority on Lamborghini Miura engineering in North America. He arrived in a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow and brought 3 assistants. He looked at the car for no more than 20 seconds before turning to Eleanor and delivering his verdict with the smooth confidence of a man who had never considered the possibility that he might be wrong. "The wiring harness in early generation Miuras is as complex as a Swiss movement," he said. "Every previous team has been working around the problem rather than at the source. I will replace the entire harness, every centimeter of it. $400,000. 3 weeks. I guarantee the result." Eleanor asked whether he had examined each individual component before drawing this conclusion. Adrian Mercer smiled, not unkindly but with the condescension of a man who considers thoroughness a quality reserved for people with less experience than himself. 30 years in this field, he said, do not require itemized confirmation. Eleanor signed the contract. 3 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday morning, Adrian Mercer called Diana and asked to speak with Eleanor. He explained, at length, that the wiring harness replacement had been executed flawlessly, that the car's electrical architecture was now comprehensively renewed, and that the persistent failure to start indicated a problem that was, in his professional assessment, likely congenital to this specific chassis, a known issue in a small number of early P400 SV units that had no reliable remedy. He returned $200,000 and flew home the following morning. He did not apologize. Eleanor stood in the garage that evening with the lights off, the halogen fixtures dark for the first time since she'd begun this process, and she looked at the shape of the Miura under its cloth in the thin light that came through the glass panels from the grounds outside. For a long time she did not move. The total was $1,700,000. 11 specialists. 3 years of her father's silence. 1 car that would not speak. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eye. No one was watching. She called Diana the next morning. "I don't want another expert," Eleanor said. Her voice was flat and controlled in the way that only barely suppressed exhaustion can produce. "I want someone who actually knows how things work. No reputation necessary. No publication history. Someone who genuinely cares about these machines." Diana was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, the specific quality of quiet that means the person has information they are uncertain how to deliver. "I know someone," Diana finally said, "but you won't like the address." Grant Auto occupied a narrow building on a side street in Cicero, a working-class suburb 8 miles west of the Chicago Loop, wedged between a tire warehouse and a building whose signage had faded beyond legibility. The facade was corrugated metal painted a color that had once been green. The sign above the roll-up door read Grant Auto in block letters that had been repainted at least twice, each layer slightly thicker than the last. When Diana arrived at 8:15 on a Wednesday morning, the roll-up door was open. A classic rock station was playing from a small radio on a shelf near the door, and a pair of work boots was protruding from beneath a 1984 Chevrolet Caprice that was up on jack stands. Diana explained who she worked for and what the job involved, speaking to the underside of a car and the legs attached to it. The boots stopped moving. "What year is the Miura?" the voice from beneath the car asked. "1971, the rolling board slid out." Lucas Grant sat up. He was 31 years old, with brown hair pushed back from his forehead and the kind of hands that told you everything about how a person spent their time. Knuckles slightly enlarged, nails kept short, a thin scar along the inside of the right thumb from a compression fitting that had let go without warning 4 years earlier. He looked at Diana for a moment. "P400 SV or SVJ?" Diana did not know the answer. Lucas stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and said, "Give me the address." Lucas Grant had enrolled in the automotive engineering program at Illinois Institute of Technology at 19 and dropped out at 21, not because of academic failure but because his father, Raymond Grant, had suffered a stroke in the middle of Lucas' junior year that left him unable to operate the shop he had run for 26 years. Lucas came home and did not go back. He had told himself for years that he would finish the degree eventually. A fiction he had mostly stopped maintaining by the time he was 25. When the shop's regulars had become his regulars, and the rhythms of the place had shaped themselves around him. What he had never stopped doing was reading. The shelf in the back office held 40 years of service manuals, technical journals, and factory documentation, Italian, German, French, Japanese, most of it accumulated by his father, the rest acquired by Lucas himself at estate sales and auto shows, and from the estates of mechanics whose families didn't know what to do with 300 pounds of technical paper. The Lamborghini Miura section occupied half a shelf and included the original factory wiring diagrams for every production year between 1966 and 1973, printed on paper that had gone translucent at the folds. Lucas had read them all. He had read them the way other people read novels, not to memorize data but to understand the logic of a particular mind working through a particular set of problems. He printed the 1971 wiring diagram before he left the shop and folded it into his breast pocket. The meeting at the Whitmore estate was not comfortable for either party, which meant it was honest, in a way that Eleanor's previous meetings with specialists had not been. She watched Lucas walk in through the garage's side entrance. No knock, no announcement, the door had been left open. And she let the silence extend for a moment before she spoke. He was not what she had been expecting, which was itself a statement about what 11 specialists had trained her to expect. "You're the person Diana found?" she said. Lucas looked at her without the particular deference she had grown accustomed to receiving. "I'm whoever's left," he said. It was not aggressive. It was simply accurate. Eleanor told him the history in 4 minutes. 11 specialists, $1,700,000, no result. She placed the $2 million check on the surface of the tool cabinet beside the car and told him the terms, fix it, and the check was his. Fail, and she would pay $500 for his time and he could leave. Lucas did not look at the check, he looked at the car. He walked around it once, slowly, both hands at his sides, eyes moving from the roofline to the sill line to the rear engine cover and back. When he reached the front of the car, he placed one hand flat on the hood, gently the way a doctor places a hand on a patient's chest to feel what the instruments miss, and stood still for a moment. Then he asked Eleanor, "When the engine cut off that night, was it immediate, or did it run for a few seconds and then die?" Eleanor stopped. She thought about it. "Immediate," she said. "My father said one moment it was running and the next it wasn't." Lucas nodded once. "That's the first question anyone has asked me that wasn't about parts," Eleanor said quietly. Lucas had already moved to the front of the car and was reaching for the hood release. He did not use the diagnostic computer that 3 of the previous specialists had wheeled in on dedicated carts. He used a flashlight, a compact LED unit he carried in the breast pocket of his jacket, and the wiring diagram he had printed that morning. He worked in silence, moving his fingers along each wire bundle with the patience of a man following a sentence to its conclusion, tracing circuits backward from their terminal points toward their origins. Eleanor stood 6 feet away and did not speak. Diana stood near the door. 8 minutes passed, then Lucas stopped. His hand had come to rest near the fuse block mounted on the firewall behind the passenger compartment. A block of 42 individual fuses arranged in a grid, each governing a specific circuit in the car's electrical architecture. He held his flashlight steady on position 7. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "Come here." Eleanor walked over. Lucas pointed the flashlight at fuse number 7. The primary circuit fuse governing the fuel delivery system, the one component whose failure would cause an engine to cut off completely and instantaneously, without warning, without stumbling, without any of the dying sounds a car makes when it runs out of fuel or loses spark. A fuse that blows naturally, Lucas said, has a melted wire inside. You can see the char at the break point. This fuse, he picked it up between 2 fingers and held it in the beam, has an intact wire. It hasn't blown. It's been removed. He turned and looked directly at Eleanor. Someone pulled this out by hand. The question you should be asking isn't how much a replacement costs. It's who took this out, and why. Eleanor's first instinct was disbelief, not of Lucas specifically, but of the sheer scale of the implication. She had paid $1,700,000 over 3 years, and the answer was a component that cost $9 at an automotive supply counter. She stood very still for a moment with her arms folded. "You're certain," she said. It was not entirely a question. Lucas did not flinch. He held the fuse up under the beam of the flashlight and walked her through the physical evidence, with the calm of a man who had spent his career in the space between what people assumed and what was actually true. A blown fuse broke at the wire and showed thermal damage at the breakpoint. This fuse was structurally intact. The wire was unbroken, uncorrupted, undamaged by heat. It had been seated in its position, had held its circuit intact for an unknown period, and had then been removed physically from its mounting. Not vibrated loose, not corroded out, extracted. Eleanor looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "Can the camera system from the garage be pulled up to 3 years ago?" Diana was already reaching for her phone. The estate security system maintained a rolling archive of 90 days of footage and a permanent archive of event-flagged recordings. Any detection of motion, door access, or environmental change triggered an automatic save that was stored indefinitely on the estate's private server. The night Margaret Whitmore died was among the saved events, flagged by the motion sensor in the garage at 11:47 post-meridian. Diana pulled the recording on a laptop she had set up on the tool cabinet. Eleanor and Lucas stood together and watched. At 11:47 and 9 seconds, a door on the left side of the garage opened. Not the main roll-up door, but the service entrance that connected to the main house's interior corridor. A man entered. He wore dark clothing and moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged in the space. He went directly to the front of the Lamborghini, directly, without looking around, without hesitation, as though he had already rehearsed the route, opened the hood, leaned over the engine compartment for approximately 40 seconds, closed the hood and walked back out the way he had come. Total time in the garage, 4 minutes and 13 seconds. The camera angle was wide, and the image had the grainy resolution of a system designed for deterrence rather than identification. The man's face was not clear, but his shoes were. Brown Oxford lace-ups with a high vamp and a distinctive double-stitch toe cap, the kind of shoe that was expensive enough to be memorable and particular enough to be identifiable. Eleanor looked at the footage and said nothing. She was quiet for 4 seconds, long enough to notice. Lucas watched her face rather than the screen. "You recognize the shoes," he said. It was not a question. Eleanor turned and looked at Diana. "Get me the access logs for the main house on that date," she said. "Every entry and exit from midnight going back 12 hours. Sebastian Crane arrived at the Whitmore estate that afternoon, as he arrived every Thursday, unannounced but expected, a habit he had maintained for years as part of his weekly financial briefing to Eleanor on the status of Whitmore Industries. He was 45 years old, well-built, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of careful grooming that communicated seriousness without vanity. He had been with the company for 20 years, the last 7 as chief financial officer, and he had been close to Joseph Whitmore in the way that long professional loyalty can resemble family. He saw the open hood of the Lamborghini from the garage doorway and a man in work clothes leaning over the engine bay, and something moved across his face, a slight tightening around the jaw, a fraction of a second's compression before the expression that replaced it, which was warm and casually curious. Another specialist, he said to Eleanor, who had walked out to meet him. I thought you had given up on that. Eleanor said that she hadn't. Sebastian looked at Lucas for a moment. Who's this? Lucas straightened up and looked at Sebastian without particular expression, the way a man looks at something he is filing carefully away. Eleanor introduced Lucas as her mechanic. Sebastian smiled, the smile of a man who finds the words slightly amusing, and excused himself. He was halfway to the door when Lucas's eyes dropped to Sebastian's feet. Brown Oxford lace-ups, high vamp, double-stitched toe cap. Lucas said nothing. He turned back to the engine bay and kept working. The access logs Diana retrieved by early evening were thorough. Sebastian Crane had entered the main house at 11:31 post-meridian on the night Margaret Whitmore died, a Thursday which was his day. He had exited at 12:04 in the morning. The garage motion event had been logged at 11:47. The timeline was precise and unambiguous. Lucas photographed the log on his phone, attached it to a message, and sent it to Eleanor without comment. Eleanor was in her father's study when the message arrived. She read it once, set the phone face down on the desk, picked it up again, and read it a second time. Then she called her personal attorney, Alexander Rourke, at his home number. It was 7 minutes past 10 in the evening. I need a full financial audit, she said. 3 years every transaction Sebastian Crane had signing authority on. Focus on anything related to mineral rights, extraction contracts, or real estate transfers. Rourke said he would begin in the morning. Eleanor thanked him and hung up. She sat in the dark study for a moment, in the chair her father had sat in every morning for 40 years, and she thought about the 11 specialists and the $1,700,000 and the $9 fuse and the 40 seconds of footage, and she thought about Sebastian Crane, who had worked beside her father for 20 years and who had stood in this garage the night Margaret died and pulled a fuse out of a car and put it in his pocket. The audit results came back in 2 rounds. The first summary arrived the following morning at 6:47, a land rights transfer agreement, executed 3 years earlier, granting extraction rights for a rare earth mineral deposit in southern Colorado to a holding company called Crane Allied Resources. The contract value was $340 million. The signature on the Whitmore Industries side of the agreement was Joseph Whitmore's. Joseph Whitmore had been admitted to Mercy General 11 days before the contract's execution date. His medical records, which Eleanor had legal authority to access, noted that he was on a continuous morphine infusion for pain management and had been assessed as having limited cognitive clarity during the relevant period. No Whitmore family attorney had been present at signing. The second round of results arrived at noon and was more specific. The commission structure embedded in the contract had directed $48 million in advisory fees to Crane Allied Resources over the subsequent 30 months. The money had moved through 3 intermediary accounts before settling. And buried in the contract's appendix, in a paragraph written in the dense, subordinated language of a man who was betting that no one would read it carefully, was a collateral clause. The clause stated that in the event the Whitmore family disposed of certain listed personal assets, including the 1971 Lamborghini Miura registered to Joseph Whitmore, control of the extraction rights would transfer permanently and irrevocably to Crane Allied Resources. The car, in other words, had to stay broken. If Eleanor eventually sold it, which she would almost certainly have done after spending nearly $2 million and achieving nothing, Sebastian would have won everything. Lucas did not go home that evening. He sat in the garage on an overturned bucket, the Miura's hood propped open, the work light on, and went through every invoice and every repair order left by the 11 previous specialists, reading them the way he read wiring diagrams. Looking for the logic beneath the language, he found it in Adrian Mercer's documentation. Buried in the final page of a 43-page invoice, under a line item listed as third-party consultation services, was an $85,000 payment to an unnamed vendor referenced only by a routing number. Lucas photographed it. He sent it to Eleanor with a single line of text. I'm not a detective, but someone paid to make sure this car stayed broken. Eleanor was still awake. She read the message and walked to the garage and stood in the doorway. Lucas was sitting on his bucket, the work light casting long shadows across the concrete, the open hood of the Miura framing him from behind. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. How much do you know? She asked. I know what I can see, he said. The rest is your problem. It's becoming everyone's problem, Eleanor said. She sat down on a second bucket, a thing she had never done in this garage, and they stayed like that for a while, 2 people in a lit room at night, the car between them, thinking. Sebastian Crane arrived the following morning without a scheduled appointment. a departure from his established pattern significant enough that Diana flagged it to Eleanor before he reached the garage. He walked in with the composed directness of a man who has prepared his position and intends to deliver it cleanly. Lucas was at the front of the car. Eleanor was not yet in the garage. Sebastian stopped a few feet from Lucas and looked at him for a moment, measuring him the way a man measures an obstacle rather than a person. "I'm going to be direct," Sebastian said. "I don't know what you think you've found, and I don't particularly care. I'll pay you $5 million, cash, to tell Eleanor Whitmore that this car cannot be repaired and go back to wherever you came from. You'll never work on a car worth more than $10,000 again if you stay, and you'll have $5 million if you leave. This is a straightforward offer." Lucas stood up from where he had been crouching. He was slightly taller than Sebastian and considerably less composed in his appearance. The work clothes, the oil-stained hands, the expression of a man who is not surprised by very much. He looked at Sebastian for a moment without speaking. "Here's what I see," Lucas said. "You walked into this garage the night Margaret Whitmore died and pulled the fuse out of this car. You paid Adrian Mercer $85,000 to make sure his work failed. And you wrote a contract clause that needed this car to stay broken so you could take a $340 million mineral deposit from a man who was on a morphine drip and didn't have a lawyer in the room. $5 million doesn't buy any of that." Sebastian's face had gone entirely still, the particular stillness of a man who has just heard his own crime listed aloud and is calculating the distance to the exit. "You're a mechanic from Cicero," he said. "No one will believe a word you say." Lucas held his eyes. "The camera will," he said. Sebastian turned toward the door. He moved quickly, not running, but with the compacted velocity of a man who knows that the next few minutes will determine everything. He came through the garage door and stopped. Eleanor Whitmore was standing in the corridor outside, her phone in her hand, the recording application open. She had been there long enough. She had heard everything. Sebastian looked at her and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. When Eleanor spoke, she did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You worked with my father for 20 years, she said. "He trusted you the way he trusted his own blood." Sebastian began to form a response. The contract had been legitimate, the signature was valid, the advisory fees were disclosed, and Eleanor raised one hand and stopped him. "A signature obtained from a man on continuous morphine without legal representation for a contract he had no capacity to review is void under Illinois statute. My attorney has been awake since 10 o'clock last night, so has yours by now." Diana stepped into the corridor behind Eleanor. Two members of the estate security staff appeared behind her. Sebastian looked at Eleanor for one more moment. A look that contained something that might have been regret if it had been pointed at the right thing, and then he allowed himself to be escorted out of the building. He said nothing else. Eleanor stood in the garage doorway for a moment after Sebastian's car left the grounds. The morning light was coming in through the glass panels at a low angle, falling across the polished concrete in long pale bars. She walked to the front of the Miura and looked at the open engine compartment. Lucas was already there, the replacement fuse in his hand. A standard automotive ceramic fuse in the correct amperage rating, purchased from an automotive supply store on his way in that morning for $9 including tax. He turned it once between his thumb and forefinger, then looked at Eleanor. "Do you want to do it?" he asked. Eleanor looked at the fuse, this small, cylindrical, unremarkable object that had cost $9 and had held 3 years of silence inside it. She shook her head. "You do it," she said. Lucas placed the fuse into its mounting with the deliberateness of a man who understands that some technical actions carry more weight than their mechanics require. He did not rush. The fuse clicked into position with a sound so small it was barely audible over the ambient quiet of the garage. He stepped back and looked at Eleanor. Eleanor walked around to the driver's door, opened it, and sat down in the cockpit of the Miura for the first time in 3 years. The interior smelled like aged leather and the particular warm dryness of a car that has been sealed and still for a long time, like a room that has been closed since someone left it. She placed her hands on the steering wheel. Her hands were not entirely steady. She fitted the key into the ignition and turned it. Nothing happened. She turned it again. The starter motor engaged, a high spinning sound, and then the V12 found its voice, a deep resonant, compound growl that built from the back of the engine bay and spread through the entire body of the car and out through the glass walls of the garage and into the morning air of the grounds outside. It was not a gentle sound. It was a sound that had been designed to be heard, the sound of 12 cylinders working in a sequence that an engineer in Modena had spent 3 years getting exactly right in the late 1960s. Eleanor sat very still with both hands on the wheel. She did not speak. Lucas stood outside the car beside the open door and watched her face. He did not say anything. He simply nodded once, the quiet acknowledgement of a man who has done the thing he came to do. Eleanor called Dr. Isaac Brennan from the garage while the engine was still running. "I need permission to bring a car to the parking lot of Mercy General," she said. "1 hour. I'll have it back on the grounds by noon." Dr. Brennan asked her to hold and was gone for 90 seconds. When he came back, he said, "3rd floor, north-facing windows. Drive it where he can see it from the window." Joseph Whitmore was in bed when the Lamborghini pulled into the visitor's lot below. His room was on the 3rd floor. The nurse on duty later noted in the care log that at 9:52 in the morning Mr. Whitmore, who had been largely unresponsive since the previous evening, sat up in bed without assistance and turned to face the window. He remained sitting for 11 minutes. Eleanor was standing in the lot below, visible from the window, her hand resting on the roof of the car. Joseph pressed his palm flat against the glass. From 3 floors below, Eleanor saw it. She raised her hand in a response. Joseph said one thing, which Eleanor did not hear through the glass, but which the attending nurse recorded because she was present in the room. He said, "She's still running." The nurse assumed he was talking about the car. Eleanor, when she was told this later, understood that he was talking about something else. Dr. Brennan's note in the patient file from that afternoon read, "Patient demonstrated significant positive behavioral shift following external stimulus. Increased verbal engagement, improved appetite at lunch, requested television remote for first time in 6 weeks. Mechanism unclear. Will monitor." Joseph Whitmore was discharged from Mercy General 12 weeks later, not recovered because the damage to his lungs was the kind that does not reverse, but well enough to go home. He was well enough to sit in a chair. He was well enough to eat at a table. He was well enough to walk slowly through the estate and stop at the garage door and look at the car that was now kept uncovered, the velvet cloth folded on a shelf, the halogen lights on, the V12 silent but present the way a living thing is present even when it is still. He stood in the doorway of the garage on his first afternoon home and looked at it for a long time. Eleanor stood beside him. "You fixed the car," Joseph said. "Someone else fixed it," Eleanor said. "I just found the right person." Joseph was quiet for a moment. "That's harder," he said. 6 weeks after Sebastian Crane was escorted off the Whitmore estate, he was formally indicted on 3 counts: financial fraud in connection with the mineral rights transfer, procurement of a forged signature on a contractual document from a party without legal capacity, and 1 count of conspiracy to impede a lawful business investigation, the last of which stemmed from the $85,000 payment to Adrian Mercer. The $340 million extraction contract was declared void by an Illinois circuit court on the grounds that the signatory had lacked legal capacity and had been without independent legal representation. Whitmore Industries recovered the $48 million in advisory fees paid to Crane Allied Resources, plus statutory interest. Adrian Mercer reached a civil settlement requiring him to repay the full $85,000 and surrendered his professional restoration certification in the state of Illinois. He did not contest either action. Eleanor offered Lucas Grant a formal contract 3 days after the fuse was installed. Not for a single repair, but for the standing maintenance and care of the entire Whitmore family vehicle collection, 17 cars ranging from a 1953 Jaguar XK120 to a 1982 Ferrari Berlinetta Boxer, with a retainer that would have allowed him to close Grant Auto and relocate to a proper facility without financial concern. Lucas considered the offer for 1 day. He came back with a single condition: Grant Auto in Cicero would stay open. The shop would continue to operate for its regular customers, the Caprices and the Corollas and the pickup trucks that needed brakes before winter, because that was where his father had started, and because Lucas believed, in a way he did not spend much time articulating, that a man who stopped hearing ordinary engines would eventually stop knowing how to listen at all. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "That's an unusual condition," she said. "No," Lucas said. "It's the reason I still know what I'm doing." On a Thursday evening 3 weeks after the case had been referred to the state's attorney, Eleanor sat alone in the garage with the overhead lights off and only the halogen fixtures running, their light falling on the Miura the way it always had. From above, clean and direct, making the yellow paint look like something lit from within. She had started the engine when she came in. It was running now, steady and low, the sound filling the glass room with the particular resonance of a machine that had been designed to be heard and had waited a long time for the opportunity. She sat in the driver's seat without going anywhere, her hands on the wheel, the idle vibration of the engine running through the chassis and the seat and into her spine. She thought about the 11 specialists who had arrived with their credentials and their confidence and their theories, each of whom had looked at a $4 million car and seen a $4 million problem. She thought about $1,700,000 spent on fuel systems and wiring harnesses and ignition components and everything, except the question of whether something was simply missing. She thought about a man in a blue work uniform who had walked into this garage and looked at the car the way her father had looked at it. Not as an asset or a problem or a professional challenge, but as a thing that had been built with logic and care, and that therefore had a reason for everything it did or failed to do. And she thought about a $9 fuse in a position number 7, sitting on a shelf in the Cicero shop right now, because Lucas had kept it. Not as evidence, the attorneys had copies of everything they needed, but because he said it was a useful thing to remember. There are problems that look enormous until someone asks the right question. There are years of silence that end with a click too small to hear across a room. There are things that money cannot purchase. Among them, the particular quality of attention that belongs to a person who learned to listen before they learned to charge for it. The engine ran on in the dark glass room, patient and deep the way it had been built to run. And somewhere on the 3rd floor of a house in the western suburbs of Chicago, a man who had been growing quieter for 3 years sat in a chair by a window and thought about a road trip he had taken in the summer of 1991. 2 people and an open car and 12 states and no itinerary. And he was not entirely sure whether he was remembering it or planning it, and for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty felt like something worth staying for.